Welcome to the Imperial Truth. I'm your host, Eric, and today we are going to spend some time talking about the Carcharadons. I think I spelled that wrong. Carcharadons? Yeah, I'm probably spelling everything wrong. I apologize. And not a great start. So I spent a lot of time on this PowerPoint on the research side, clearly not the spelling side. Um, so this is going to be a little bit of a long one, and we're gonna get into some of my own personal fan theories. So full disclosure, this is just my personal interpretation. I like doing this sort of thing. Hopefully, you enjoy participating in it and kind of sharing your thoughts, which I'm always happy to hear. I please don't get upset or too upset about it if you don't agree. That's totally okay. So I will point out that there's a little bit of hypocrisy here. I really, really hate the Space Wolves. I hate them. And I can't exactly articulate why, but one of the reasons is because they're the wolfy wolf time people with their wolf dreadnoughts and their wolf space armor and stuff like that. And I don't know why I like the Carcharadons as much as I do, because in reading their story, it's very much the same concept. Um, anyway, so I think everybody has sort of their own superpower. My superpower is sort of indexing everything I've ever read or learned or heard, and then my mind just automatically draws red string connections to it. So perpetually in the background of my mind is these series of bulletin boards where I'm sort of connecting the dots for everything, and it's not always true. It's not always real, for sure. It is a detriment for sure in relationships, but it's kind of fun to do in the 40k lore and the horse heresy lore, because there's a lot of sort of things to dip into. So we're going to do that today. This is going to seem like a weird journey, but we will get there in the end. I promise you that we will. And most of what we're talking about today is based on these three books: Red Tide, Outer Dark, and Void Exile. These are Robbie McNiven's trilogy of the Carcharadons. They are pretty good books. I'm gonna say that they're not sort of the best 40k books that are out there, but real brief reviews. I really liked Red Tide. I think it set the scene for the Carcharadons really well. It pits them against the Night Lords, which is a great matchup for them for a number of reasons. Just a great introduction to the faction, and if you want to know about them, this Space Marine chapter, this is where I would start. The Outer Dark, also a good book. A little bit of a spoilers. This one deals more with the Tyranids and a Gene Stealer insurrection. And there will be spoilers all through today, so just be aware of that. It is, I would say it's not quite as good as the Red Tithe, but it also introduces a lot of lore and stuff about the faction. The Void Exile, which is the third book in the series and the most recent, it happens a lot later in the series. I think there's 70 years, if I'm remembering right, between Outer Dark and Void Exile. In this time, the Carcharadons have been Primarchified, which I'm not super excited about. I'm going to be honest. It's a little frustrating, and it does have Vashtor and some amazing body horror with the sort of servants of the Infernal Architect. So that's great. But yeah, there's some parts of this one that it's not. I don't know. It's not as good as the other two books. It's still fine. It's good. Definitely read it. And after reading this and seeing, this is an aside, reading this and seeing the what are they called, the red oh my gosh, Huron Blackhearts guys, the space pirates that just got released. I'm totally blanking on the name. I apologize. You're screaming at your screen right now. Red Corsairs. The Red Corsairs are those models would be great for Carcharadons. Just putting that out there. If you wanted to do some conversions, they would be amazing Carcharadon models. But yeah, so let's get in here and let's talk about this. So a little bit of the Carcharadon history, and there are going to be discrepancies today because the lore is sort of all over the place, and I think that lends credence to actually my sort of theory or hypothesis here, because of the fact that it is all over the place. So maybe the Carcharadons, I keep spelling with an R, maybe the Carcharadons are part of the 23rd founding, which happened in late M37, early M38, or, maybe they're part of the second founding, which happened in M31. Just 8,000 years difference in time, not a big deal. Also, it's worth mentioning that in the story, they mention the writs of exile being issued in M36, which also doesn't follow this timeline, because the writs of exile coming 1,000 years before the chapter was founded doesn't make sense, or having happened 6,000 years after the chapter was founded also doesn't make sense. So the timing of that is sort of all over the place. And I will point out that some of these references, not the 23rd founding one, but the M36 one, is in the Robin McNiven books. So there are discrepancies even in those books. And I'm assuming that those discrepancies are there on purpose. So yeah, they are a fleet-based chapter, but it is very clear that they once had a home world, which will come back later into play, but that they are no longer welcome at that home world. So there's that. They are codex compliant chapter, more or less. For example, they have chaplains and librarians. The librarians wear blue, the chaplains wear black. They are organized into 10 chapters. Their fleets operate a little bit differently in that they have scouts that are sort of attached to the regular chapters, and they have first company veterans that are attached to not the chapters, the companies, and they have first company vets that are attached to the companies as well, and they also have sort of destroyers and stuff sprinkled in there. So they are more or less codex compliant with sort of the normal tactical flexibility things you would expect from a fleet-based chapter, where you can't sort of deploy the whole chapter in one go. It is suspected that they are a Raven Guard successor, and this is very, very tenuous. There's almost no. Let's put it this way. I was through a lot of wikis and a lot of data, and in no place do I see any sort of suggestion that this is actually true. It is speculative based on some things that we'll talk about later, and I believe somebody, maybe Robbie McNiven himself, posted that they were. So there's sort of that going on too. Spoilers for what we're going to talk about. I don't think that they're a Raven Guard successor. They first appear, to my knowledge, in the story in the Badab War lore. So that's sort of the first time they pop in terms of like the chronology of the stories. Now, in the lore, obviously they're around a lot earlier than the Badab War, but that's the first sort of time that they pop in storylines, to my knowledge. They're currently led by Tiberos, the Red Wake, who may be a title rather than a person. In the second book, they discuss that maybe a new person has taken up the title of Tiberos. So that might not be an actual Space Marine. It might just be a title, which is interesting because if you're familiar with the Minotaur's lore, there's some speculation that their chapter master, who I can't remember their name, is also maybe a title rather than a person. So we kind of get this theme in sort of the Badab War stuff. And also, can we just point out this incredible art by Andre Narl? I don't know if I'm pronouncing your name right, but it's linked here. This is freaking great lore art. There's not a lot of good art out there for these guys, and so when I find an artist, we'll definitely tag them and give them credit, because that's just freaking cool. All right, so the Carcharadons, I keep putting the R, please ignore that. I'm gonna keep pointing it out because it bothers me now. But yeah, they have a very unique culture, like probably on par with Space Wolves level uniqueness to their culture. They serve Rangu, who is the Void Father or the Sire of the Forgotten One. This is the Emperor. Those are all titles that they sort of ascribe to the Emperor, and they don't call him the Emperor. They call him Rangu, and they call him the Void Father, and they call him the Sire of the Forgotten One. The Forgotten One is very clearly their Primarch. And they never sort of say anything about who the Primarch is, except that it's the Forgotten One, and assuming that the Forgotten One is still alive, because they do talk later about the Forgotten One coming back or returning. So there is that. They have this founding document that's alluded to a couple times called Beyond the Veil of Stars. It's written by the Shade Master, who seems to be the first chapter master. So this is sort of their founding document. And it's interesting that they don't have sort of a founding document like the Codex, or like written by Gilliman, or the prophecies written by Sanguinius. They don't have something that's sort of written by their Primarch. They operate under the writs of exile, which were issued when they were exiled. Is basically the rules under which they are exiled from the Imperium. We don't ever find out why they were exiled from the Imperium, but they clearly were, and they have been for a long time. They sustain themselves through these two tithes, the red tithe, which is their ability to go in, and anytime they defend an imperial world, they can just tithe the population. So they can take sometimes everybody. They can't take people who are part of the Imperium, so they can't take like Ministerium people, or like Adeptus Arbites, or people from the Mechanicum. But any sort of normal citizenry is fair game, and they take them by the tens to hundreds of thousands when they undergo a red tithe. They also have a gray tithe, which is a long-standing tradition that they have with the Mechanicum, or the Mechanicus, where they go and gather things in the outer dark. So they are operating sort of the outer dark isn't really defined, but I'm assuming that's sort of above the galactic plane. So if you're not familiar, I guess I should put a slide for this in. The Milky Way exists on sort of a plane. It's sort of a disk, more of a disk than sort of a sphere. And so it's much harder to get sort of the edge of the galaxy on the fringes. But if you go up or down, respectively, you would be outside of that plane. And that seems to be where they're operating. So when they go out there, there's a bunch of Dark Age technology and very old things, and they will gather anything that they can. In fact, in the second book, one of the things that they gather is just a keel tag for a ship. It's just literally a Dark Age technology keel tag, but it's Dark Age technology, so it's super valuable. They bring that to the Mechanicus, and then the Mechanicus turns around and gives them like Terminator suits and bolter ammunition and anything that they need to sort of operate. And this is sort of their thing. And from my understanding, and I could be wrong, but the first company is sort of like the secret police. They go and attach to all the other companies in squads of 10, and they're sort of there to make sure that the will of Tiberos gets executed. And then the second company is in charge of the Gray Tithe, so they're out kind of scouting the outer dark, gathering materials, and getting that stuff together. And then the third company is in charge of the red tithe. They're the ones in charge of like gathering the flesh for the force. And so that's sort of how they operate. They have a strong legacy of slavery that's really kicked into in the second book, where they talk about it a few times. And this is beyond just like sort of your Spear of the Emperor type, like we have thralls and they are definitely slaves. This is full on, like, kind of hate to say it, but almost like chattel slavery, where they treat all of the humans under their control like slaves. It is a very distinct, different concept than you see in other. It's a lot more brutal. It's a lot more what you would expect from sort of a renegade chapter than you would expect from sort of a loyalist chapter, which is again sort of interesting for this overall like culture of the chapter. And specifically, I think this is important to note because I think that the sort of lexiconum page doesn't talk about this enough. They pray to Rangu. They in the first book, the main character Shaw goes and prays to Rangu, and later they talk about there being services where they pray to Rangu. Not every chapter prays to the emperor. They may venerate him, they may admire him, but to my knowledge, there's only a few chapters like the Black Templars who actually worship him as sort of a godlike figure, which is again, really interesting for sort of the differences in the culture. So you can see that these guys are very distinctly different from any Space Marine chapter, except for, like I said, maybe the Black Templars or the Space Wolves kind of fit into this sort of like, we are very, very, very distinctly different from the rest of the Imperium. They also have a few mutations that are worth noting. So they have black skin, black eyes, and pale skin, specifically completely black eyes rather than just like really large pupils like the Raven Guard are described as having. Their eyes are completely black. They have very pale skin, although it's not said that they're I forget what the membrane is, that there's a mutation that the Raven Guard have that doesn't work, that basically doesn't allow them to produce pigment. That's not mentioned here. They just have pale skin. And specifically, the older they get like denticles, which are essentially like shark scales on their skin. And the older Carcharadons get more and more and more of this. They are also subjected to this thing called the blindness, which again is a little bit nuanced. It's not really deeply mentioned in there, that they go into this berserk state. Then they kind of lose their training and discipline. It's a lot like very similar to the red thirst that the Blood Angels seem to undergo, and specifically, it's mentioned several times in the books that they're attracted to blood scent, and bloodlust is sort of constantly at the back of their minds. So they do seem to have a little bit of like Blood Angel style kind of red rage thing going on. It's worth noting that they also have a very cold demeanor. Now, this is listed as in some of the wikis as sort of a mutation as well. I think it's their counter, and if you read the books again, I think that the way it's presented is their cold demeanor is them trying to counteract that bloodlust that's always there. So they're kind of almost like world eater level anger issues, and the cold demeanor is sort of their mask of this and their way to keep it at bay. And lastly, I want to point out that there is this thing called the Sable Brand that is mentioned for the Raven Guard. It is, as far as I know, it is only an Imperial armor mentioned. That's the only place that I can find it mentioned. But it does mention sort of this cold demeanor that there, and sort of a bloodlust that's associated with the Raven Guard. But I think that that's been backed away from. I don't remember seeing that in any other books and any other mentions of Raven Guard. I mean, they don't have a lot of books about Raven Guard, but I've never seen it anywhere else. If somebody knows of one, please let me know. But yeah, it's worth noting that these guys are, again, their gene seed is not pure, and they definitely have some characteristics that are again not unique to Space Marines, but are pretty different from what we would consider sort of baseline Space Marine behavior. There are some big incongruities with their story as well. They fought in the Seventh Black Crusade, which is in 811 M37, which means that they can't have been a 23rd founding, because that was at the end of M37. So it seems unlikely that they were founded and then fought in the Seventh Black Crusade at the same time. I mean, maybe, but if they were in the outer dark for thousands of years, let's say like 6,000 years, and then they popped back in during the Seventh Black Crusade, it might have seemed like they were part of that founding, though, right? So you can see sort of how these pieces start to fit together. They bear markings on their armor from the Terran Pacification War, which, if you're not familiar with that lore, is a pre-Great Crusade thing. So this is before the Emperor even leaves Terra. He had some of the Space Marines fight to conquer that. Some Space Marines bear that on their armor. And it is mentioned that this is the chapter's first honor, which is a quote. Because, again, it's interesting that it's mentioned as a chapter here, and it's interesting that it's mentioned as there. So one of the big sort of counter theories to what I'm going to propose is that these guys were just Raven Guards that kind of got exiled by Corvus Corax. And if they were Raven Guard, I don't know that they would call that their chapter's first honor, because that wasn't the chapter. They were part of the Raven Guard Legion at that point. It's an interesting mention. And it speaks to the fact that they are definitely older than, M38. In this. They use the word brother back and forth to describe both the Night Lords and the Ashen Claws, which are both Raven Guard successors, which is an interesting use of the word, because usually, with at least in the Horse Heresy books, brother is reserved for people that are in your legion, and cousin is usually used for people from other legions. So that's an interesting use of the word. It's at least in the majority of the times that it was used, from the most I can tell. Again, kind of rereading these books. If you interpret brother to mean another Space Marine that is 10,000 years old that lived during the Great Crusade, that gets rid of like 75% of the brother mentions. In that case, it does make sense. So I don't know how you want to interpret that, but it's interesting that they describe it both for Night Lords and essentially Raven Guard. Tecaharange, I think is the way that it's pronounced in the books, is supposedly 3 generations, again quotations, from the Wandering Ancestors. The Wandering Ancestors are apparently the original exiles that left 10,000 years ago. But yet there's a Night Lord in the story in the first book that is as old as the Horus Heresy, and the demon that is sort of involved in that sort of hints that Tecaharange is as old as that Night Lord. And I think in the second book, it's also hinted that Tecaharange is as old as the Horus Heresy. So again, like, what does this mean? Where are we at with 3 generations? I don't know. It's just an interesting incongruity with the timeline. It does say explicitly at one point that the chapter has served for 10,000 years, which again suggests that they are Horus Heresy era. And the tech adept in the third book notes specifically, and I didn't get the exact quote, but because I was audiobooking it, but notes that they are not new forms, but old forms that predate the Imperium. It was some quote like that, which again kind of hits at this idea that they existed during the Terran Pacification Wars, as opposed to during the more recent times. So just kind of putting all that out there, building that one out there. Here's a quote. We have a couple quotes I think are really important. So this one's from Red Tithe. So to the Carcharadon Astra, he was Rangu, the Void Father, sire of the Forgotten One. Like the Carcharadons, his vigilance was eternal, a beacon in the night, the bane of the encroaching shadows. Shaw's chapter had left humanity for the emptiness of the outer dark when he had still walked among mortals, and they would not return until he did so once more. Only with the coming of the Forgotten One could the edicts of exile be overturned and the chapter's eternal crusade in the darkness be brought to an end. So there are a couple important things here. First of all, we get the distinction of Rangu, the Void Father, sire of the Forgotten One. Forgotten One, definitely Primarch if the Void Father is the sire. Also, interestingly, in here is this quote that the Carcharadons had left humanity when the Emperor was still walking among men, which means that they were exiled before the Great Crusade. Before the Horus Heresy happens, right? Which is an interesting timing in all of this. So here's another quote. This is another one from the Red Tithe. This book is probably the best in terms of sort of setting the stage for this. Their creed, the Carcharadon's creed, was an old one, older than the superstition and the beliefs of the current imperial cult. Theirs was not some blind faith based on hollow praise and lavish decorations. Their memories of the emperor were of a living, breathing titan, and Terra was far more to them than some distant hub of galaxy spanning bureaucracy. Their connection to it was ancient and primal. It had sustained their loyalty and determination for 10,000 years amidst the loneliness of the outer dark. And when they had first been banished, none had expected them to survive, let alone remain united as a chapter. But survive they had, their desperate heritage bound by it. And then it goes on to talk about that. This is sort of the scene when Shaw is praying in a chapel to the emperor, kind of hitting at this idea that they have a religious belief system that's sort of outside the imperial cult, and based on the fact that they had interacted with the emperor when he was alive and when he was interacting with humans. In addition to all of this, kind of just hammering home this idea that this is a chapter that has been around for 10,000 years and is it like literally predates the second founding. So this is a pre-second founding chapter at least. They have mixtures of Mark 2 to 5 armor. So the current Mark, aside from Primaris, is I think Mark 7 armor. So these guys are dealing with heresy level armor. They use cryostasis in transit to kind of keep their brothers kind of subdued. As a note in the Flight of the Eisenstein, Nathaniel Garrow talks about having been in cryostasis. He was also a Terran pacification war person, and that was a technology that they used at the beginning of the Great Crusade, but then abandoned pretty early on. So again, this idea that these guys are not only using technology from the Great Crusade, but are using technology from sort of the early side of the Great Crusade. The command squad in the third company has a Volkite caliver attached to it. So Volkite calivers are exclusively a Horus Heresy era weapon. I think I read somewhere, and you guys can correct me if I'm wrong, that the intention actually was for all Space Marines to have Volkite calivers as their main weapon, as opposed to bolters, because the caliver would run off the Space Marines power pack, and they would never ever run out of power. They'd never run out of ammunition. And so that would be the superior weapon. But it could never be sort of done because the technology on Mars wasn't sufficient to build enough of them. And then the Horus Heresy happened, and bad things. So yeah, the Void Revenant, which is a ship that they have in their fleet, is a Crusade, specifically mentioned as a Crusade era ship that's been part of the fleet since the first day of the exile. One of the characters, I want to say Cordy, has a Phobos pattern bolter that predates the Imperium. Again, quotation from the books. They have a group of wandering ancients that are part of the chapter. 3 dreadnoughts that are sort of in stasis all the time because they are literally absolutely freaking crazy to the blindness, and are just berserk. And they are called Contemptor dreadnoughts, but when one drops into combat in the second book, it's described more as a Leviathan dreadnought. So a little bit of a discrepancy there, but it doesn't matter because neither Contemptor nor Leviathan dreadnoughts are common at all in the 41st millennia, and here the third company has 3 of them. So again, that's just not usual. The White Maw, which is Baelshaw's, the third company's main ship, has Ursus claws. So Ursus claws are these big claws that shoot out of the ship and basically harpoon another ship and hold them there so that you can do boarding actions and stuff. Ursus claws Ursus claws are exclusively to the World Eaters, guys. They're the only ones in the story that ever shoot an Ursus claw from a ship. So yeah, just throwing that out there. Again, that's kind of one of these references to a different a chapter. Legion that's out there. It does mention that the Night Corps, which is Tiberius's ship, sort of the main ship of the flagship of the entire chapter, is a holdover from the heresy. And all of these points about all of their war gear and all of their equipment that's super old and predates the Great Crusade and all this stuff. That's despite the Grey Tithe, right? So they're constantly getting influxes from the Mechanicus of new material. But somehow this chapter has sort of almost unlimited, right, ancient technologies that they can just keep using this stuff over and over and over again, which is kind of interesting. It's again one of those kind of ideas that are kind of weirdly present throughout the stories. So with that said, let's start talking about some interactions that they have with other groups and sort of laying that boundary. So at this point, hopefully I have established very clearly that there are discrepancies in the lore, but that the majority of the information that we have definitely suggests that these guys predate the Horus Heresy. That not only are they not a second founding chapter, they were founded before the Horus Heresy even happens, which is interesting. It's very interesting because we don't have any other groups like this that predate the heresy that are their own distinct groups. So these guys, they interact with this group called the Ashen Claws. The Ashen Claws are a Raven Guard. They're not a successor chapter because they're renegades. And it seems like they were exiled by Corvus Corax. So there is a part in the lore where Corax basically, for whatever weird reason, again, this just doesn't make sense, but it's in the lore, so we'll mention it, kind of gathers his legion together before the Horus Heresy during the Great Crusade. And he's like, you guys are too different from what I want for my chapter. So like, get the hell out. And he just exiles them and sends them to the Ghoul Stars to go fight. It's so weird. It's such a weird thing to put in the lore, but it's in there. So it's worth noting. So the Ashen Claws are apparently one of these groups. And instead of doing what Corvus Corax wanted them to do, they allegedly became renegades and just basically ran away and did their own thing. And they've been doing their own thing for a long time. And they have, it's hinted that the Carcharadons have sort of these alliances with different renegade groups where they can like trade material. And so they come to the Ashen Claws at one point, and they basically are interacting with them. Now, a couple of notes here. They provide them with weapons and gene seed. We'll get to the gene seed in a minute. I think here a lot of people are like, oh, they got gene seed from them, therefore they are the Carcharadons or Raven Guard, and that's an interesting thought, but we'll get there in a second. I will also point out here that they specifically say that the Ashen Claws have forsaken the Forgotten One, which is interesting because it goes directly against what I'm going to propose later. And I feel like it's fair to mention when things don't line up with sort of my hypothesis here. I don't want to only present information that supports my claim. When something doesn't, I'm gonna put it out there. Also, not a lot of good art of Ashen Claws, but we got this cool painted assault marine from the Ashen Claws, which is very cool looking. Yeah. So the Ashen Claws in this this book, which is the second book, they make some statements that are really interesting. Firstly, they mention the unique legacy of Baal Shar, and this got me thinking about, like, are the Carcharadons maybe a mongrel chapter? They literally call them mongrels. Is it one of those things where the Carcharadons aren't one lineage, but are sort of an amalgamation of lineages, right? So maybe some of them are Blood Angels, some of them are, Raven Guards, some of them are what's it called? World Eaters, right? Like maybe that's sort of why we're seeing all these weird mixes of their characteristics. Now, I don't think that that's what's happening, but it's worth noting that there's a little bit of evidence here. So I forget the Ashen Claws chapter master leader says to Baelshaw, I asked you a question, mongrel. And then later they talk about the gene seed, and they said, you've not corrupted it with your breed. And they call them traitor born scum, which again is really interesting. Like why call them traitors when they're clearly not? Like the Ashen Claws are the traitors. And maybe this is just, renegades being renegades, and sort of like the posturing, because there's a lot of posturing that's happening here. But I'm going to put forward a few things that may shed some light on this. Number one, it just kind of put this all out there. Maybe the gene seed that the Carcharadons gave was Ravengard gene seed, not because they were donating some from their gene stocks, which are definitely genetically corrupted, right? We just talked about the fact that these guys have a unique mutation that isn't found in any Ravengard successor, the denticles and stuff, and that the blindness doesn't seem to be a Ravengard thing either. So definitely corrupted gene seed. So if they gave them Carcharadon gene seed, that would be corrupted. So where are they getting Ravengard gene seed? Well, maybe they're getting Ravengard gene seed from some other location. Like maybe the you know, who knows where they're getting it from, but maybe the Adeptus Mechanicus thinks that they're Ravengard and give them Ravengard gene seed because they kind of like manage the gene seed sometimes. You know, maybe that's part of it. But it's interesting that they, you know, that they do that. Also, if indeed the Ashen Claws were a group that was exiled before the heresy, right? They wouldn't have this kind of concept of traitors necessarily. But yeah, we'll talk about that again. So like maybe the Carcharadons are actually traitors based on the Ashen Claws perspective, based on things that we'll talk about in just a minute. It's just a kind of interesting aside to pop out there. Okay. And then I just want to throw out these last kind of conflicting accounts to kind of like balance things because I said that I wanted to, you know, provide you with as much information as I can with this hypothesis. So Arcus Fall is a Raven Guard character from the Horse Heresy, who I believe is called the Shade Lord, or is a Shade Lord. I'm not real big on Raven Guard lore, unfortunately. And he apparently is exiled with about 4,000 Raven Guard when Corvus Corax joins the Legion. And for the purposes of what we're going to talk about in a minute, it's worth noting that Corvus Corax is found after the Rangdan Xenocides. And Arcus Fall and most of the people that are kicked out are Terrans. So there is that. If the Carcharadons are based off of Ravengard, who were Terrans, why did they have a home world? More specifically, when did they have a home world? That doesn't really make sense. And it is very clear that they did have an oceanic homeworld that still exists and they're not welcome there, right? And Terra doesn't have oceans at the time of the Unification Wars, so it's not Terra. Yeah, it's this really weird sort of like what, you know, what's their homeworld? When did they have this homeworld? At what point in the story? Because again, we've already established that they left the Imperium before the Horus Heresy. So they left during the Great Crusade. They were exiled during the Great Crusade and kicked out. But at some point they had a homeworld between when they left Terra and before they found Corvus Corax. That just doesn't make sense for this. And the Edicts of Exile apparently exiled them from their homeworld, so they didn't have a homeworld before, or sorry, after the Edicts of Exile, right? It's just kind of sequencing things to the best of that we know. Also, why Edicts of Exile? Why the Red Tithe? Why the Gray Tithe? Why all of this? None of those things exist in the Horus Heresy. We're never told about them in the Horus Heresy. They never pop up in a story. They clearly happened during the Horus or before the Horus Heresy, during the Great Crusade. They're never talked about. There's never this conversation in any of the Raven Guard books about these exiled Carcharadons that left, that went around the galaxy. You know, why were they issued? When were they issued? Right? Like we don't have that information, and it does seem to like not fit into the narrative of these guys are Raven Guard. All right. So with all that said, let's dip into another Robbie McNiven book that I read so you don't have to. I really wanted this to be a good book, guys. I really wanted Oaths of Damnation to be a good book. I like Robbie McNiven's stuff on the Carcharadons. I like the Exorcists a lot. I think that they're a really cool chapter with a lot of potential. Yeah, and this just wasn't a good book. It just, I mean, if you like the Exorcist, read it. It's fine. But it is, yeah, it just doesn't do a lot. But I want to point out that I'm a grognard here as recently as the ninth edition codex. So both the ninth and eighth edition codexes for Space Marines, the Exorcists are specifically called out as a chapter with an unknown lineage. And give me a second, I'll pull it up on my phone because I screenshotted the actual quote to read to you guys. Um, so it says the Exorcists are sorry, people are very loud right now. The Exorcists are speculated to have come from the 13th founding. Their progenitor is known only to the highest ranking members of the Ordo Malleus, so the Inquisition, and details of their creation have been placed under Inquisitional seal. The Exorcists maintain two additional scout companies, blah, 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 blah. So it's inferred there that not even the Exorcists know who their progenitor is. But in Oaths of Damnation, they're an Imperial successor. So we're just going to rewrite the lore there. So we do get situations where we just rewrite lore and just to establish that sometimes these books, and specifically a book by Robbie McNiven, comes out and they just rewrite sort of the pre-existing thing. So maybe in this case, we have a situation where the existing lore was that the Carcharadons were a Raven Guard, and we're moving towards something else, which is what I think is happening. All right. So with that said, let's again kind of pull in some other ideas. And if this seems complex or convoluted, I apologize. This is the way my brain works. So there are some similarities with the Carcharadons to other legions. So, for example, like the Luna Wolves, these guys love the spearhead assault. They hold their first company back in teleport chambers, and at the last minute, when they pin down the enemy command structure, they bring in the first company and they chop off the head. That is very much a Luna Wolves strategy. That is literally sort of their signature move. These guys, they do it. They are berserkers like the World Eaters, although they are cold berserkers. They don't make noise when they fight, but they still are constantly fighting that berserk rage. Like the Blood Angels, the scent of blood seems to arouse them and get them sort of even angrier. They seem to have a blood rage and in the blindness that they can fall to, very Blood Angel-esh. Like the Space Wolves, they have a lot of kind of weird culture outside of the normal Space Marine concepts. And they have animal mutations, which we see a couple times as this sort of idea that some of these these legions have these built-in mutations that may or may not be intentional. So if you're familiar with the lore, the Blood Angels, Red Rage, the Space Wolves, Wolfen, those seem to be intrinsic. They're not bugs, they're features. And so it seems like they're intentionally placed there. And so maybe the Carcharadons have a similar thing where they have this animal mutation that pops up the longer that they live, and like the Space Wolves get more wolfy the older they are. The space sharks get more sharky the older they are. Like Night Lords, these guys are terror troops. They exist to terrorize their foes. And like the Word Bearers, they worship the Emperor, which is, again, pretty unique among Space Marine chapters or legions. And I will point out that in our sort of legions, there is a lot of redundancy. So we see redundancy built into the legions and the Primarchs on that matter. That seems to be intentional from the Emperor. The Emperor seems to have acknowledged that, there's going to be attrition. People are going to die. Maybe we'll lose a few of these Primarchs along the way. We should probably double up on their characteristics. So the Raven Guard and the Night Lords both strike from the shadows. They both have this sort of hit and run tactic thing going on. They do it differently, but there's enough overlap between the Raven Guard and the Night Lords that Konrad Kurz hates Corvus Corax, like hates him. And they are mortal enemies because of this. Of course, there's the rivalry between the Imperial Fists and the Iron Warriors, both siege specialists, but sort of opposite sides of the spectrum. And Rogodorn and Perturabo kind of hate each other, again, because of this. The Imperial Fist and the Ultramarines sort of have the like sort of jack of all trades, master of none thing going on, where they're sort of equally good at everything in all ways. And you could probably toss in the Iron Hands here, though they're a little bit more specialized with things. But yeah, we get this sort of like, to the point where again, Rogaldorn and Gilliman don't like each other in the Scouring series. They are very much at odds, mostly because they both want to be in charge. They both want to be running things. The Iron Warriors, the Death Guard, and the Iron Hands, they all are sort of like, bring it, we're going to take it, we're super resilient, we're going to just walk through fire and endure whatever we can, and we're going to win based on the sheer force of will. All of them have that in common. And the Blood Angels, World Eaters, and Space Wolves are all sort of berserk, crazy, angry killers when they sort of get roused to anger, to the point where it's uncontrolled in some points, and it's kind of hard to kind of rein them back in when they engage in this. The Raven Guard and the Alpha Legion are both sort of like spies and covert operations specialists. Again, just pointing out that overlap. The White Scars don't have a lot of sort of overlap with other legions, which is interesting. But they kind of overlap with the Space Wolves and sort of the noble savage idea that they're both barbaric or perceived as barbaric by people outside of the legions, and there's overlap there. The Alpha Legion and the Dark Angels is an interesting one. But the overlap here is that the Dark Angels are good at everything. They're the first. They have all of the components of all of the other legions built into themselves. They do everything that everybody else does, and Dark Angels fans will tell you that they do it better. It's worth noting that in the Alfarius Primarch novel, he talks about the fact that the Alpha Legion are so good at doing war, how all the other legions do it, that they can, one, completely perfectly mimic any legion and the way that they fight, and they can go in and do a tactical analysis of, say, the Dark Angels and be like, okay, well, this is the way that these guys are fighting, so we're going to fight in the way that's most complementary towards them. So just like the Dark Angels can fight war in any way, the Alpha Legion can fight war in any way, and that is sort of their specialists. And I think it's really interesting there, again, that one of them is the first and one of them is the 20th, but that Alfarius was the first Primarch that was found, and Lionel Johnson is the first Primarch that was created. So there's a lot of sort of mirroring there as well. And then, of course, you have like the Salamanders and the Iron Hands that are, both big into smithing and crafting and forging armor and things like that. Sort of overlap there. So you get a lot of this throughout the legions, and I'm sure I missed some, and I'm sure if you want to put Salamanders, Iron Hands, and Iron Warriors in there, because Perturabo was also very into building, like you can do this all day. There's any one legion probably has like half a dozen to a dozen characteristics that sort of sum up them and their Primarch, and then you can create this. I've tried to this huge graph where you kind of like draw all the overlaps to kind of see where everybody kind of has duplicates in there, and it's interesting. So I'm going somewhere with this, but it's a thing that we want to keep in our minds. So the last thing I want to point out here is that we have these very specific legion roles that are kind of laid out. So the Dark Angels are a check on the Mechanicum. They're there so that if the Mechanicum gets out of whack or out of line, they can come in and just curb stomp them, and make sure that they don't get into AI again. The Space Wolves are the Emperor's Executioner. If you need somebody to die, specifically a Primarch, you unleash the wolves. And that is a bad thing. It's actually so, we'll get into this in a minute, but it's such a big threat that at one point Sanguinius confides in Horus about the red thirst and says, hey, I think they might unleash the wolves on me. And then in the beginning of the first Heretic, there's a conversation where they're basically talking to Lorgar, and they're like, hey, listen, dude, there was a conversation of whether or not the Space Wolves should be unleashed. And actually, for the first time in the history of the Imperium, Magnus the Red and Leman Russ both agreed that they should not be unleashed to kill you and your legion. So this was a big threat. Like other legions knew that the Space Wolves were sort of the executioners. The Alpha Legion were the protectors of the Imperium. Again, in the Alfarius book, if we assume that it's true, which maybe it's not, but Malcador basically raises Alfarius or Omegon to be sort of the person in the shadows who's there to protect the Imperium. And that's their role. And we'll probably do a video at some point where we talk about rewriting some of the Horus Heresy lore to be a bit better and not include John Grammaticus. And in that lore, we'll talk a lot about the Alpha Legion and this idea of them as the protectors of the Imperium. The Imperial Fists are the defenders of Terra. They're the bulwark. There's a reason why the Emperor, after Ulanor, goes back and pulls Rogaldorn with him and is like, "You're coming with me. You're going to fortify the homeworld." The Ultramarines are the administrators and the Empire builders. So as a quick note, if you have read the first Scouring book, and the last of the End of the Death books, yes, yes. One of the things that is really apparent there is just how incredibly good at administrating Gilliman is, and how he almost takes over the Imperium just because he's trying to save it. He's basically like, "Hey guys, I will fix this." And it's just what he does. He just kind of compulsively is an empire builder. And that is definitely their role. The Thousand Sons, well, Magnus the Red was made to fuel or power the Golden Throne. That was literally why he was created. So he has a role. And there are some roles that are unknown. So there, we get some groups that we're not sure what they were supposed to do. And that is actually part of why the Horus Heresy happens, is that Horus and some of the other, a lot of them, in fact, not even Horus, not even all the traitors do it. So like Jagatai Khan has this conversation too, where they're basically like, yeah, we don't know what's going to happen to us after the Great Crusade. And we're really worried that they're going to give our conquest, all the stuff that we conquered, all the stuff that we were able to do, that they're gonna just give it to the mortals, and they're gonna forget about us, or worse, they're going to treat us like they treated the Thunder Warriors and actually destroy us. And so that is literally one of the main plot points at the beginning of the Horus Heresy that kind of drives this. And I want to point this out because, again, we're kind of getting into a little bit of my theory. So the Emperor knew about the Tyranids. I think I don't know that it's in the Horus Heresy books, but in sort of some of the ancillary stuff, it's hinted that like there were already gene sealer cults at work in the Imperium, or in the Milky Way galaxy, before the sort of the Pharos plotline happens. So the Emperor knew that the Tyranids were coming, and maybe Sanguinius did too. If you read the Dante books, there are some hints in there that Sanguinius probably, I mean, he's prophesying things, so he's probably seeing the Tyranids. It definitely seems like Tyranids. Dante interprets it as Tyranids coming to the galaxy. And I think personally that a number of the legions were intended to be sent into their path. That there were a bunch of legions that the Emperor was just like, yeah, you guys are important for conquering the galaxy, but once we conquer the galaxy, there's not a lot else that I'm going to need you for. And his intention was just to send, 1 million, 2 million Space Marines into the path of the Great Devourer to intercept them and basically starve them out in space, right? So, a Space Marine is going to kill a lot more biomass than it's going to give up in terms of the Tyranids. And the idea would be that they would just basically exhaust the Tyranids in the vacuum of the outer dark. And the groups that I think were supposed to be part of this were the Luna Wolves, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, the Night Lords, the White Scars, and maybe even the Blood Angels in this group, because those are all more or less expendable. And if you look at sort of what their characteristics are, the Death Guard, the Night Lords, the World Eaters, those are all groups that are really, really brutal, really savage, and not very governable. Why keep somebody like Angron around? He seems like a liability. And once he starts putting the nails in his sons' heads, like that seems really, really weird. Why keep that? And Conrad Kurz is literally a monster. Like, why keep them around. Well, I think the intention was after the Great Crusade, after the Milky Way is sort of pacified and everything is owned, they're going to be like, okay, now head up into the outer dark and go fight those Tyranids that are coming in. And if you wanted somebody to fight the Tyranids, the World Eaters, the Death Guard, the Night Lords, the White Scars, the Blood Angels, like those are all groups that I'd want them fighting the Tyranids, right? So I think that was sort of the intent with this, which brings us to the Carcharadons. So in the second book, they kind of introduce this idea that the Carcharadons are there for judges and judgment. I'm not sure where to go with this, but it is worth noting that Cowrie says that we are mankind's judges, and when they stray, they are punished. We serve the Imperium, not man. And Tekurenge later says, we are the protectors of humanity and its judges. When the shadows strike, we strike back. From the outer dark we come, and into its depths we shall return. So this idea that again, that we have these legions with these specific roles, and the Carcharadons also view themselves as humanity's judges, which is kind of a weird thing, right? Like that's an odd a cultural kind of thing for them to take on to themselves. But I think that as we go, we're gonna see why that's the case. All right, now some of you have probably figured out where I'm going with this, and you're maybe screaming at yourselves, but that's okay. So we have during the Great Crusade, there is this event called the Rangdan Xenocides. And we really don't know a lot about this, except that it extends from 839 to 890 M30. So it's only like a 50-year period. It's not a long time in terms of the Great Crusade, except that it was brutal. We had nine legions engage in these fights. There were, I think, 3 different Rangdan Xenocide campaigns, at least 3 Titan houses, right? The Dark Angels get reduced so much during the Rangdan Xenocides. The crap is kicked out of them so badly that it goes from basically speculation that pre-Rangdan, Lionel Johnson's probably going to be War Master, which makes a lot of sense. He's the first, he's the best, he's sort of like the best of everything. And then after the Rangdan Xenocides, they are so defeated that they can't justify him being the War Master anymore. So that's how badly this goes. I think like I want to say like 80,000. It's a huge number of Space Marines are killed during this, right? Like basically an entire legion is destroyed. And during this fight, during the Rangdan Xenocides, at some point, the Space Wolves are deployed against the Lost Primarchs, which we'll talk about in a minute. And this campaign is so bad that it's sort of treated with even though they won, even though the Rangdan are defeated, they sort of view this as almost like a defeat or a shameful event because of everything that happens in here. Now, if you're not familiar with this part of the lore, there are 2 Primarchs and 2 legions that are missing, the 2nd and the 11th. And this has been part of the lore for a long time. We're never really given any direct information about these Lost Primarchs because they want to keep it sort of a mystery. And in fact, we get these kind of like lore drops here and there. If you look at the Wikipedia or the Lexiconum site for it, it literally catalogs them all, and they're all like, oh, we can mention them that they exist, but we don't really get any information about them. We do get a reference that they are called the Forgotten and the Purged. We're going to come back to that. And it's suggested that something happened during the Rangdan Xenocides that went really poorly. Maybe they switched sides. Maybe they fell to the Rangdan. We really don't know. We do know that the Leman Russ and the Space Wolves were unleashed to stop them, and they did. It's hinted in different places that at least one was killed. Maybe both were killed. We don't know. I want to point out that in this, I think is very important that the while the legions have their minds completely wiped of everything around this experience, that the Primarchs do, and the legions do remember the second 11th Primarchs. They remember them. They're not allowed to say their names. They're not allowed to talk about them. Their statues have been taken down. They've been wiped from the Imperial annals. But in the first heretic, the Imperial, sorry, the Imperial Fist, the word bearers, that legion, the word bearers definitely know about the second and 11th legions. They definitely know about the second and 11th Primarchs. In fact, they have like this hypothesis that the numbers are rolled into the Imperial Fists and the Ultramarines, and that's why their legions got so big, sort of after the Rangdan Xenocides. So yeah, so they definitely know about them. They're not allowed to talk about them, but it's definitely sort of a secret. And the second thing I want to point out is that when Ferrus Manus is killed, when his head is removed and he is dead, there is still speculation of, can a Primarch even be killed? Can a Primarch die? Like, I know his head's 15 feet away from his body, but is he really dead? Can you even kill a Primarch? Like, there's real speculation about whether or not this is possible. And I think this is interesting because if Leman Russ killed both Primarchs, right? If he killed the second and 11th Primarchs, there would be no question of whether or not Primarchs could be killed, right? It wouldn't be a speculation thing. So yeah, I would say that, it's probably likely he killed maybe one, but probably not both of them. And this is maybe confirmed a little bit by the fact that in the Imperial dungeons, and one of the, not Grey Knights, one of the Custodes books, they're like codexes, I think, is it mentions subject 11 in the Imperial dungeons, which, just going to point out, is also the number of the Primarch that is one of them and that is missing. So it may be that Leman of the Russ beat the crap out of them and dragged them back into Terra in chains, rather than killing them, which would explain why people don't know whether or not they can die. So this all happened. So, kind of just tossing that out there. All right. So we're going to get to this quote, and then I'm going to put forward my theory, and you guys can scream at me in the comments and tell me that I'm a complete idiot. And that's fine. I love it. So the Carcharadon Astra, he was Rangu, the Void Father, the sire of the Forgotten One. Like the Carcharadons, his vigilance was eternal, a beacon in the night, a bane of the encroaching shadows. Shaw's chapter had left humanity for the emptiness of the outer dark when he had still walked among mortals, and they would not return until he did so once more. Only with the coming of the Forgotten One could the edicts of exile be overturned, and the chapter's eternal crusade in the darkness brought to an end. So where do I think the Carcharadons come from? I think that during the Rangdan Genocides, two of the Primarchs, the two Lost Primarchs, were compromised in some way. One of them had a homeworld. That was an ocean homeworld. That's where you get the Carcharadons. I think that one of them, probably the 11th, was discovered maybe, before the Rangdan Xenocides, gets reunited with this chapter, renames them the Carcharadons to kind of represent the connection to this homeworld of oceans and ocean creatures. Crusades with the Crusade Force. During the Rangdan Xenocides, he gets compromised in some way. He gets corrupted, he gets captured, whatever, something happens, and the Space Wolves get dispatched against him, right? When this happens, maybe the lost one, is probably killed. He's the one that dies, and his legion gets divided between the Ultramarines and the Imperial Fists, because that's part of the lore as well, right? But the guy who gets captured, maybe the 11th, right? Subject 11, the Forgotten gets captured and brought back to Terra. And as part of this process, maybe his surrender, right? Maybe he surrenders to the Space Wolves rather than gets sort of decimated by them. Part of that agreement is, hey, my sons aren't going to be executed and my legion's not going to be disbanded. We'll exile them. And the emperor's like, yeah, let's exile them. Let's send them into the void so that they can intercept the Tyranids, assuming that they're going to die. And again, all of this happens before the Horus Heresy. So these guys, they head out into the outer dark with 100,000, 50,000, whatever many tens of thousands of Astartes goes out there. They're in the outer dark for centuries, millennia, right? They're out there for like 6,000 years. And then they get a distress call that that they need to come back and fight the 13th or the 7th Black Crusade or whatever it is. And they pop in and they come out of nowhere and start fighting for the Imperium, right? And they have all this arcane weaponry and armor and ancient stuff, and speak an old version of a High Gothic, and keep themselves secret because they are exiled. They're not allowed to interact with the Imperium, right? I think that this fits really, really well. I think that these guys are one of the Lost Legions, specifically probably the 11th Legion, Sires of the Forgotten, right? One of the Lost Primarchs, and sort of all of this stuff about them being Raven Guard successors is all smoke and mirrors, to kind of keep us on our toes and keep us kind of ignorant to the clues that are there. This also I think fits in with sort of my long-term expectations for the Warhammer 40,000 universe, which is that they are going to move us towards sort of a setting transitioning, ending, not they're not going to blow up the world like they did with the old world. They'd make too much money off this IP, but I do think that they realize that having legions and having the emperor and having primarchs is way more money making than sort of the path that they were on before. And so I would be really surprised if, a decade from now, we didn't have some forgotten one pop back in and the Carcharadons, reunite with that. And you get this 11th Primarch that pops out. Like, I could see that happening. So yeah, let me know what your thoughts are. Let me know if you think that I'm a complete nut job, and completely wrong. If I missed something, or got something wrong other than spelling Carcharadon wrong all through here, let me know. And I'm curious to know your thoughts. Somebody asked what my hypothesis was, or my crazy theory was that upset the person at my store. This is the theory. This is what upset them. And I get it. It's kind of out there and weird and crazy, but also I think that there's a lot of traction to a lot of these ideas. So with that said, have a great day. And just as a quick programming note, we will do a lot of Mechanicum stuff in the coming weeks. The new kits are coming out tomorrow. The new book is coming out. I will pick that stuff up tomorrow and start to put together some videos, and try to put that stuff out as fast as I can. I do this as a side project, so it's not my job, and so it takes a little bit more time for me to get stuff out. But yeah, it looks pretty cool, and I'm excited to share that stuff with you guys. I will see you in our next video.